At the corporate event, my unfaithful wife sneaked away with her lover, only to return and find a gift box on the table. With a smirk, she said, "My husband is such a naive fool, but I do love his gifts." Little did she know that this box marked the start of my ruthless plan to get back at her, a plan that would turn her life into a nightmare. The annual gala at Lyman & Company was an unforgettable affair. Every detail, from the sparkling chandeliers to the live string band, screamed elegance. It was the kind of event that represented success, the success I had spent over 20 years building. Tonight should have been a celebration of my hard work, but instead, all I felt was emptiness as I stood by the bar, sipping my whiskey. Across the room, my wife, Sophie, was the center of attention. Her navy dress fit her perfectly, and her laughter echoed like music over the background hum of conversation. Everyone admired her, and I once believed that was her greatest gift, her ability to make people feel special. Now, though, I wasn't so sure. I watched as she leaned in close to James Taylor, a new, eager employee at the company. His hand brushed hers, lingering a moment too long for it to be innocent. I clenched my jaw. "Adrian, aren't you joining us?" my co-worker Greg asked, giving me a playful pat on the back. "In a minute," I replied, forcing a smile. But my eyes never left Sophie. I watched her tilt her head back in laughter at something James had said, the familiar pang in my chest growing stronger. It was the same feeling I'd been trying to ignore for months. At 9 o'clock, Sophie suddenly stood up, whispering something to James. They walked out together, disappearing through the grand doors of the ballroom. My grip tightened around my glass. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. I knew what was happening. My eyes shifted to the small, silver box I had placed on our table earlier that evening. It wasn't an anniversary gift or a token of affection. No! It was the first piece of a plan that would bring down the perfect image Sophie had so carefully built. When Sophie returned 20 minutes later, her cheeks were flushed, her lipstick slightly smeared. James followed behind, looking as composed as ever, though I could see beads of sweat on his forehead. Sophie immediately noticed the silver box. Her eyes lit up with curiosity. "For me?" she asked in a sweet tone. I nodded, keeping a neutral face. "A little surprise," I replied. She turned to James, lowering her voice to a whisper. "My husband is such a naive fool, but I do love his gifts." James chuckled, clearly pleased with himself. "Open it," I said, my voice calm. Sophie untied the ribbon, and with precise fingers, she peeled back the wrapping. Inside, she found a small key resting on a velvet cushion. She blinked, clearly confused. "A key to something special," I answered, raising my glass. "You'll find out soon enough." Sophie laughed nervously, tucking the key into her clutch. I saw a brief flash of uncertainty cross her face. It was subtle, but I could tell I had her attention. The ride home was quiet except for the soft hum of the engine. Sophie was absorbed in her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. I glanced at her, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Who are you texting?" I asked casually. "Just Lisa," she replied without looking up. Lisa was her best friend, or rather, her favorite alibi. I nodded, pretending to believe her. But the truth was, I had known about Sophie's affair for weeks. It all started with small signs, late nights at yoga, mysterious charges on our credit card. All of it leading me to the truth that Sophie's phone had suddenly become an extension of her hand. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself I was overreacting. But the evidence kept piling up. 2 weeks ago, I found the smoking gun I had been searching for. I was looking for my passport in Sophie's gym bag when I stumbled upon a second phone. Unlocking it revealed a treasure trove of messages between her and James, explicit, shameless, and damning. My stomach turned as I read their plans to drain money from our accounts and start a new life together. That night, I made a decision. If Sophie wanted to play games, I would show her who was a master. Every detail had to be flawless. Sophie was clever, And James was arrogant, but not entirely foolish. If I wanted my plan to succeed, I needed to be precise. This wasn't just about catching them. It was about dismantling the very foundation they were building together. It all started with our finances. Sophie had been subtly draining money from our joint account, but she underestimated how closely I monitored my investments. I didn't freeze the accounts all at once. Instead, I transferred most of the funds into accounts she couldn't access, leaving just enough for her to continue her act without noticing anything was wrong. Next came the private investigator. His name was Jack, an ex-detective with a tough exterior and a knack for discretion. When I handed him Sophie's second phone and explained the situation, he nodded, clearly understanding. "People like this always get too comfortable," Jack said. "Leave it to me." Over the next 2 weeks, Jack provided a steady stream of evidence. Photos of Sophie and James at a quiet cafe, time-stamped messages of their secret meetings, and even footage of them entering a luxury store where they picked out items Sophie charged to our joint credit card. But the real piece de resistance came when Jack uncovered the apartment. Through Sophie's financial trail, I discovered she and James had bought a small but pricey flat on the outskirts of the city. It was their secret hideaway, paid for with my hard-earned money. I couldn't help but marvel at their audacity. I visited the apartment myself, pretending to be a potential buyer. When the realtor handed me the keys for a private showing, I planted hidden cameras in every room. The footage was streamed live to my phone, giving me a front-row seat to their betrayal. The final touch was the silver box. I knew Sophie wouldn't be able to resist a mystery. The key inside wasn't just a symbol, it was bait. It would lead her to the place where her lies would unravel. By the time I finished my preparations, a strange calmness settled over me. For weeks, I had been consumed by anger and hurt. Now, I was focused and determined. This wasn't just revenge. It was justice. Friday came with a chill in the air. I left the office earlier than usual, telling Sophie I had a late client meeting. She kissed me on the cheek, her usual excuse ready. "I'll probably just have a quiet night at home," she said. I smiled, pretending to believe her. "Don't wait up," I replied, slipping into the car. Instead of heading to the office, I drove to the apartment. I parked a block away out of sight and settled in to wait. My phone buzzed with updates from Jack, who was stationed nearby. At precisely 8:14 p.m., a sleek black car pulled up. Sophie stepped out first, her red coat billowing in the wind. James followed, carrying a bottle of wine. They laughed as they made their way inside. Oblivious to the hidden cameras documenting every move, I waited until the clock struck 10 before making my move. The walk to the apartment felt like an eternity, each step weighed down with anticipation. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from the excitement of what was about to unfold. When I reached the door, I knocked twice. The sound echoed through the quiet hallway. Inside, I heard the shuffle of footsteps, hushed voices. Finally, the door opened, and there stood Sophie, her face going pale. "Adrian," she whispered. Behind her, James appeared, his expression shifting from confusion to panic. He gripped the wine glass tightly, as if it could somehow shield him. "Good evening," I said calmly, stepping inside. The tension in the room was thick. Sophie opened her mouth to speak, but I raised a hand, silencing her. I pulled out my phone and pressed play. The screen showed a live feed of the apartment, capturing every kiss, every touch, every whispered word they thought was private. "I hope the wine's good," I said, my voice cold. "It's the last drink you'll be having here." The aftermath was swift and brutal. The first blow came on Monday morning at work. I walked into the boardroom, where James was seated among my senior team. Sophie had no idea I was about to dismantle their lives. I started the meeting with an announcement. "James is terminated, effective immediately. Evidence has come to light that he is engaged in unethical practices, including misuse of company funds and personal misconduct," I said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside was everything Jack had gathered. Not just proof of the affair, but also instances where James had used company credit cards to fund their escapades. James's face turned ashen. "This is a mistake," he stammered, but the evidence was undeniable. Security escorted him out within minutes. For Sophie, the fallout was even more personal. I filed for divorce the same week, presenting the court with the financial audit and video evidence. The judge's ruling was swift. Sophie was left with nothing. Our social circle turned against her. The glamorous woman everyone had admired became a pariah, and even her closest friends, like Lisa, distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with her disgrace. Sophie tried to plead with me, showing up at my office unannounced. Her tears, once so convincing, now fell hollow. "Adrian, I made a mistake," she sobbed. "Please, we can fix this." I stared at her, my voice cold. "The only mistake was thinking I'd let you get away with it." Months passed, and life began to stabilize. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. The anger and hurt that had consumed me were replaced by a quiet satisfaction. One evening, I found myself back at the riverbank near the apartment. In my hand was a key, the same one I had placed in the silver box all those months ago. I turned it over in my palm, reflecting on everything it symbolized. This key had unlocked the truth. It had exposed the lies, the betrayal, and the hollow foundation of my marriage. But it had also set me free. With a flick of my wrist, I tossed the key into the river. It disappeared beneath the surface, swallowed by the water. As I walked away, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Revenge isn't about destruction. It's about reclaiming your power. And in reclaiming mine, I had found something far more valuable myself.